He was a beautiful little prince, born to inherit a life of unimaginable privilege, but his devastating illness made him the ultimate royal embarrassment, resulting in a cruel banishment that the House of Windsor hoped history would completely forget. When we look back at the grand, sweeping tapestry of the British monarchy, we are so often blinded by the glittering tiaras, the triumphant carriage rides, and the carefully curated portraits of familial perfection that adorn the walls of our national galleries. Yet, beneath that heavily gilded surface lies a history of profound ruthlessness, a chilling emotional detachment that was considered not just acceptable, but entirely necessary for the survival of the crown. To truly understand the modern firm, and to perhaps put the endless, tedious whining of certain self-exiled royals in Montecito into its proper, rather pathetic perspective, we must travel back to the dawn of the 20th century. It was a time when the British Empire was at its absolute zenith, sprawling across the globe, but the ancient monarchies of Europe were already beginning to hear the faint, terrifying rumbles of revolution. In this suffocating atmosphere of duty, immense privilege, and creeping paranoia, King George V and Queen Mary were bound by an unspoken, ironclad rule. The royal family must project an image of absolute, unshakable physical and moral perfection. There was simply no room for human frailty, no tolerance for weakness of the flesh or mind, and certainly no patience for a child who could not flawlessly play the part he was assigned at birth. Before we continue, take a second to subscribe. These videos don't always get recommended, and this way you won't miss the next one. When Prince John Charles Francis was born on the 12th of July, 1905, at York Cottage on the Sandringham estate, there was absolutely no hint of the dark, protracted tragedy that would eventually consume his short life. He was a remarkably robust, beautiful baby, the sixth child and fifth son of the future king and queen, welcomed into the world with the standard booming gun salutes across the capital and the joyous ringing of church bells throughout the nation. York Cottage itself, however, was a remarkably oppressive environment for a rapidly growing royal family, a decidedly cramped and gloomy residence that King George V obstinately adored simply because it reminded him of the austere naval quarters of his youth. The house was notorious among the wider, more glamorous extended family for its dark, narrow corridors, its suffocatingly heavy Victorian furnishings, and an atmosphere that felt more akin to a strict, loveless boarding school than a warm family home. A source within the inner circle from that era noted that the sheer density of royal children, stern nannies, and highly anxious courtiers crammed into such an unyielding, unglamorous space created a constant, thrumming pressure cooker of expectations. In these early days, little Prince John was the undisputed darling of the nursery, a sweet-tempered and engaging infant who seemed entirely destined to follow the traditional well-trodden path of his older brothers into the military and lifelong public service. Queen Mary, a woman whose majestic, icy exterior often masked a complex and deeply constrained emotional life, initially found genuine solace and maternal joy in her youngest son, completely unaware that this beautiful boy would soon become the greatest test of her unwavering loyalty to the institution of the crown. As the months turned into the first few years, however, a slow, creeping anxiety began to infiltrate the hushed, heavily carpeted rooms of the royal nursery, replacing the initial joy with a quiet, terrified dread. It started with the subtle, highly guarded observations of the nursery staff, the expertly trained women whose entire livelihoods and reputations depended on producing flawless royal specimens for the public stage. John was, as they nervously whispered amongst themselves, rather slow to reach the standard milestones of childhood development. His speech was significantly delayed, his movements occasionally uncoordinated, and his attention often drifted away into a private world entirely his own. A well-meaning staff member later recalled the excruciating, suffocating tension that would instantly descend upon the nursery whenever King George V entered the room, his booming voice and aggressively demanding presence immediately overwhelming the sensitive, easily frightened toddler. The king was a rigid, inflexible man who famously declared that his children should be frightened of him just as he had been terrified of his own father, and he possessed absolutely zero capacity to understand or accommodate a child who did not respond to harsh naval discipline. For Queen Mary, the dawning realization that her youngest son was fundamentally different struck at the very core of her deep-seated insecurities, forcing her into a torturous internal monologue where her natural instincts as a mother warred violently with her all-consuming duty as a future queen consort. She found herself entirely trapped in a gilded cage of her own making, acutely aware that any whisper of defect or abnormality within her offspring would be seized upon by the press and the vicious whispering classes of high society as a profound, unforgivable failure of her royal duty. To comprehend the absolute terror that Prince John's condition struck into the hearts of his parents, one must understand the intensely fragile political climate of the era in which they were preparing to ascend the throne. Across the English Channel, the grand ancient empires of their royal cousins in Russia, Germany, and Austro-Hungary were beginning to visibly fracture, fundamentally threatened by rising tides of socialism, violent public unrest, and a growing, dangerous disdain for inherited, unearned wealth. The British monarchy was acutely, almost pathologically aware that their own survival depended entirely on maintaining a flawless illusion of divine right, supported by an unbroken image of vigorous health, moral superiority, and unblemished physical perfection. A well-placed source noted that within the shadowy, echoing corridors of Buckingham Palace, there was a deeply ingrained, almost superstitious fear of genetic taint, a sheer terror that the public would view any physical or mental weakness as a definitive sign that the royal bloodline itself was exhausted and unfit to rule. Therefore, a child who did not fit the precise cookie-cutter mold of a royal prince was not merely viewed as a private family sorrow. He was instantly categorized as a direct existential threat to the stability of the entire British institution. The senior courtiers who surrounded the king and queen, men whose own considerable power and prestige relied entirely on the flawless functioning of the monarchy, began to silently calculate the catastrophic damage that this increasingly unpredictable child could inflict upon the royal brand. It was in this suffocating crucible of dynastic paranoia and institutional self-preservation that the foundation was quietly laid for what would become one of the most ruthless and systematic cover-ups in the modern history of the British royal family. Faced with this terrifying, unacceptable reality, Queen Mary did exactly what she had been trained to do since birth. She violently suppressed her private agony, strapped on her metaphorical armor of diamonds and pearls, and presented an impenetrable mask of stoic perfection to the outside world. She threw herself into her grueling schedule of official duties with a cold, relentless efficiency, seemingly compensating for the secret shame of her youngest son by demanding absolute, unquestioning perfection from her older children, who were constantly paraded before the public as paragons of British virtue. The inner emotional toll of this deeply fractured existence must have been profoundly devastating. An endless, exhausting daily performance where she was forced to essentially split her soul in two, the grieving mother privately despairing in the confines of her boudoir, and the magnificent, unfeeling queen smiling benignly from the balcony of Buckingham Palace. A source behind closed doors whispered that the king and queen formed a silent, terrible pact during this dark period, an unspoken agreement that the preservation of the monarchy must always, without a single exception, take absolute precedence over the needs of one inconvenient child. As little John continued to miss his developmental markers, utterly failing to grasp the rigid protocols and high expectations of his royal station, the invisible walls around him began to rise, slowly and deliberately cutting him off from the normal rhythms of family life. He was gradually excused from official family photographs, deliberately left behind during high-profile public appearances, and carefully ushered out of the room whenever visiting dignitaries arrived who might ask awkward questions. The golden, magnificent facade of the House of Windsor was being meticulously maintained, brick by golden brick, while behind the scenes a little boy was being systematically and coldly erased from his own family's narrative. By 1909, the polite, desperate fiction that Prince John was simply a late bloomer began to disintegrate under the weight of a terrifying new reality. At just 4 years old, the nursery, once a place of quiet, slow development, was shattered by the onset of his first major epileptic seizures. In the early 20th century, such a diagnosis was not merely a medical tragedy. It was a social death sentence, often viewed through a lens of medieval superstition or Victorian degeneracy. For a family that claimed a divine genetic right to rule over a third of the globe, the presence of the falling sickness was an unthinkable stain. A source within the inner circle recalled the sheer, unadulterated panic of the nursery maids when the boy first collapsed, his little body racked by violent, inexplicable tremors that no amount of royal protocol could command to stop. The medical men of the era, draped in their heavy frock coats and grave expressions, offered little more than archaic observations, and the chilling suggestion that such fittings were often precursors to a complete breakdown of the mind. For King George V, a man who viewed the world through the rigid binary lens of naval discipline, John's condition was an affront to the very order of the universe. He could not fix it with a shouted command or a brisk inspection, and so, in his frustration and growing embarrassment, he began the psychological process of distancing himself from a son who had fundamentally failed his first inspection. The atmosphere within the palace corridors during this period became one of hushed, frantic containment as the problem of Prince John moved from the nursery to the boardroom of the monarchy's survival. There was a pervasive, suffocating pressure to ensure that not a single whisper of the prince's infirmity reached the ears of the burgeoning mass media or the increasingly cynical public. This was a time when the eugenics movement was gaining a dark intellectual foothold among the elite, and the suggestion that the British royal family carried a mental defect could have been weaponized by Republicans to argue for the total dissolution of the crown. A well-placed source noted that the senior courtiers were less concerned with the boy's physical suffering and far more preoccupied with the optics of a prince who might have a grand mal-seizure during a trooping the color or a state opening of Parliament. Every royal outing became a tactical nightmare. The prince was increasingly kept behind heavy velvet curtains or in remote rooms of the various royal estates, his existence guarded by a phalanx of loyal staff sworn to absolute silence. The boy was effectively becoming a prisoner of his own status, a living secret whose very presence required a constant, exhausting operation of concealment that drained the emotional reserves of everyone involved. For Queen Mary, the diagnosis was a personal catastrophe that she was forced to process in a state of chilling, mandatory isolation. We can only imagine the agonizing internal monologue of a mother watching her child slip away into the dark clouds of neurology, while simultaneously being told by her husband and her advisors that the boy must be hidden for the greater good of the empire. She was a woman who lived by the creed of never complain, never explain. But the sight of her youngest son, dazed and exhausted after a seizure, must have pierced even her formidable composure. Yet, her response was to lean further into the cold, clinical distance required of her station. She began to view John not through the eyes of a nurturing parent, but through the disappointed gaze of a curator looking at a damaged artifact. A source behind closed doors remarked that she increasingly delegated all decisions regarding John's care to doctors and nannies, as if by removing herself from his physical presence, she could lessen the sting of his imperfection. This was not merely coldness, it was a survival mechanism for a woman who believed that her primary purpose on earth was to be the impeccable consort to the king-emperor. To acknowledge John's humanity was to acknowledge the flaw in the dynasty, and that was a betrayal she simply could not permit herself to commit. The psychological toll on John's older siblings was equally profound, creating a fractured family dynamic that would echo through the generations. His brothers, including the future King Edward VIII and King George VI, were raised in an environment where their youngest brother was treated as a source of quiet shame, a distressing element that one simply did not discuss at the dinner table. They were taught, explicitly and implicitly, that vulnerability was a liability, and that those who could not keep up with the relentless demands of royal life were to be discarded or pushed to the periphery. A source within the inner circle observed that the children were often steered away from the nursery when John was having a bad day, fostering a sense of fear and alienation toward their own flesh and blood. This early exposure to the monarchy's capacity for cold erasure undoubtedly contributed to the emotional stuntedness of the future Edward VIII, who would later show such shocking callousness toward his brother's plight. It also deeply affected the future George VI, whose own struggle with a stammer made him acutely sensitive to the palace's intolerance for imperfection. The royal nursery, which should have been a sanctuary of sibling bonds, became instead a training ground for the ruthless prioritization of the crown over the individual. As John reached the age of 7 and 8, the palace's PR problem intensified as he became increasingly difficult to manage within the traditional royal residences. His seizures were becoming more frequent and his behavior more erratic, a common occurrence in the era before modern anticonvulsants. He was often described as having a charming but peculiar nature, showing signs of what we would today likely recognize as high-functioning autism alongside his epilepsy. He had a fascination with gardening and a literal mindedness that made him a delight to the staff but a source of constant social anxiety for his parents. A well-meaning staff member recalled how the prince would often break protocol by speaking out of turn or failing to recognize the importance of the guests he was introduced to. For the king, these were not the innocent quirks of a child. They were signs of a weak mind that could not be permitted to represent the House of Windsor. The long-term consequences of this mindset were beginning to crystallize. The decision was quietly made that John would never be allowed to take his place in the public eye. He was to be the first of the hidden royals, a precedent that would see other inconvenient relatives, most notably the Bowes-Lyon cousins, sequestered in institutions decades later. By the time the family moved to London for the king's coronation in 1911, the erasure was nearly complete. While his brothers were being fitted for miniature uniforms and taught how to salute the cheering crowds, John was kept in the shadows, a ghost in the grand machinery of the state. He was the lost prince long before he was physically sent away, a boy whose name was beginning to fade from the official records and whose face was becoming a memory to the public that had once celebrated his birth. The surrounding pressure to maintain the Windsor brand had successfully suffocated the life of a young boy, transforming him into a liability to be managed rather than a son to be loved. As we look at the modern landscape, where the Sussexes demand privacy while simultaneously selling every intimate family detail to the highest bidder, one cannot help but feel a sharp, cynical pang for Prince John. He was a boy who truly deserved the protection of his family, yet he was the one truly sacrificed at the altar of the crown's image, a silent victim of a dynasty that, in its quest for immortality, had forgotten how to be human. The architecture of his exile was now being drafted in the private offices of the king's secretaries. It would not be enough to simply keep him in the nursery. He needed to be removed from the primary line of sight entirely. The plan was shifting from concealment to banishment, a move that would eventually take him to the lonely, windswept edges of the Sandringham estate. The consequences of this decision would resonate for a century, serving as a dark reminder that for the Windsors, the institution is the only thing that truly lives, while the individuals are merely temporary and sometimes disposable tenants of the crown. The year 1913 marked a definitive, chilling shift in the palace's strategy. The Prince John problem transitioned from a medical concern managed in the nursery to a strategic PR crisis managed by the most senior courtiers in the land. By now, the boy's seizures were becoming more frequent and significantly more violent, often leaving him in a state of prolonged exhaustion and confusion that was impossible to disguise during brief family encounters. The atmosphere within the higher echelons of the household was one of clinical cold calculation, as the king's private secretaries weighed the boy's humanity against the sanctity of the royal brand. One must understand the sheer, overwhelming pressure of the era. The press was becoming more intrusive, and the public's deference to the throne was no longer a guaranteed birthright. A well-placed source noted that the decision-makers within the palace viewed John not as a suffering child, but as a potential leak that could compromise the entire vessel of the monarchy. They were haunted by the prospect of a photographer catching the boy mid-seizure or a foreign diplomat witnessing a fit that would then be whispered about in every court from St. Petersburg to Berlin. In this climate, the machinery of erasure began to turn with terrifying precision as the palace embarked on what can only be described as a systematic unpersoning of the young prince. He was quietly removed from the official order of precedence, and his name began to appear with less and less frequency in the court circular, the official record of royal engagements. It is a fascinating, if dark, irony when one considers the modern landscape of royal complaining. We hear Prince Harry and Meghan Markle constantly lamenting the lack of protection they received from the palace's communications team, yet they have absolutely no concept of what true institutional ruthlessness looks like. For John, there was no protection of his personhood, only the protection of the crown's image through his total disappearance. A source behind closed doors remarked that the senior royals and their advisors reached a consensus that John was to be treated as if he were already a ghost. His seat at the table remained empty, his name went unspoken in polite company, and the public was encouraged to simply forget that the king had 5 sons instead of 4. The inner monologue of King George V during this period was likely one of profound, resentful disappointment, a sentiment that replaced any lingering paternal warmth. He was a man who prized physical vigor and military bearing above all else. To him, a son who was faulty was a personal affront to his legacy. He viewed the boy's condition through the harsh, uncompromising lens of a Victorian patriarch who saw illness as a moral or genetic failure. Meanwhile, Queen Mary's struggle remained deeply hidden behind her rigid, bejeweled corsets, though she was complicit in the clinical nature of the erasure. She allowed the courtiers to draft the plans for John's removal without a public word of protest, prioritizing her role as the king's consort over her role as a mother. A well-meaning staff member recalled the heartbreaking sight of the queen walking past the nursery door without entering, her face a mask of iron-willed denial, as if by ignoring the boy's existence she could make the tragedy vanish. The pressure to maintain the Windsor brand had effectively lobotomized the family's capacity for public empathy. The surrounding atmosphere at the various royal residences became increasingly strained as the secret became more difficult to contain. Every servant, from the highest-ranking lady-in-waiting to the lowliest scullery maid, was well aware of the silent prince hidden away in the upper floors, yet the omerta within the household was absolute. To speak of Prince John was to risk immediate dismissal and social ruin. This culture of silence created a toxic environment of whispers and sidelong glances, where the very walls of the palace seemed to sweat with the weight of the unspoken. The long-term consequences of this policy of absolute secrecy were devastating. It fostered a royal culture where unpleasant truths were not dealt with, but buried. This out-of-sight, out-of-mind philosophy would go on to define the Windsor approach to crisis management for a century, leading to the disastrously cold handling of everything from the abdication crisis to the internal struggles of Princess Diana. They learned early on that if a person doesn't fit the mold, you simply break the mold and throw the pieces away. As the plans for John's permanent relocation were finalized, the clinical detachment reached its peak. It wasn't just about moving him to a different house, it was about ensuring he was physically sequestered from the inner circle of the family's life. The choice of Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate was a strategic masterstroke of isolation. It was close enough to be monitored, yet far enough to be entirely separate from the main house's social functions. A source within the inner circle noted that the courtiers were meticulous in ensuring that John's establishment at Wood Farm was entirely self-contained, with its own staff, its own kitchen, and its own rules. He was being given a miniature kingdom of one, a gilded cage where he could be as imperfect as he liked, provided no one of consequence ever had to see it. The boy was effectively being retired from the royal family at the age of 11. His career as a prince ended before it had even truly begun. The final decisions were made with the cold efficiency of a corporate restructuring. There were no long, tearful goodbyes or public announcements of a private medical leave. Instead, there was simply a quiet transition, a late-night carriage ride, and a new set of instructions for the staff at Sandringham. The palace had successfully managed the PR problem by removing the human element from the equation entirely. In their eyes, the monarchy was now clean again. The blemish had been excised, and the king could continue to project an image of imperial strength to a world on the brink of war. But for the young boy being driven away from everything he knew, the consequences were far more intimate and permanent. He was being cast out of the light and into a lifelong shadow, a sacrifice to the insatiable god of royal reputation. The physical relocation of Prince John to Wood Farm in 1916 was not framed as a medical necessity for the boy's well-being, but rather as a clinical final solution to a lingering institutional embarrassment. Wood Farm, a relatively modest flint-walled farmhouse on the furthest, most windswept edge of the Sandringham estate, was a world away from the stifling grandeur of Buckingham Palace or the crowded corridors of York Cottage. The atmosphere there was one of profound melancholic isolation, where the North Sea gales would rattle the window panes and the gray Norfolk skies seemed to press down on the roof with an almost physical weight. For a child accustomed to the rhythmic, regulated life of the royal nursery, being deposited in this lonely outpost must have felt like being cast adrift on a deserted island. A source within the inner circle remarked that while the palace officially described the move as providing the prince with a quiet country life, the reality was far more stark. He was being mothballed, tucked away in a place where his increasingly frequent seizures and unusual behaviors would no longer distress his parents or risk the gaze of the curious. The pressure on the small household staff at Wood Farm was immense, tasked as they were with the impossible dual burden of providing genuine care for a severely ill child while maintaining a perimeter of absolute secrecy. At the center of this lonely world stood Charlotte Lala Bill, the devoted nursery maid who had been with John since his birth and who now became his entire universe. Lala was a woman of extraordinary, quiet fortitude, and a well-meaning staff member later recalled that she was the only person in the entire British Empire who truly saw John as a boy rather than a problem. Her inner monologue must have been one of simmering, silent resentment toward the king and queen. She watched as the letters from the palace became infrequent, and the visits from John's mother grew shorter and more clinical. Lala became his mother in every sense that mattered, shielding him from the cold indifference of his father and providing the warmth and physical affection that the rigid Windsor Protocol strictly forbade. She created a bubble of humanity within the cold machinery of royal banishment, ensuring that while John was forgotten by the world, he was at least cherished within the four walls of that farmhouse. For King George V and Queen Mary, the Wood Farm solution allowed them to effectively compartmentalize their youngest son into a separate, manageable reality that rarely intruded upon their own. The psychological distance they created was as vast as the physical one. A source behind closed doors noted that the king rarely spoke of John, and when he did, it was with a clipped naval brevity that suggested the boy was a casualty of a war they were no longer fighting. Queen Mary, meanwhile, channeled her maternal guilt into a meticulous, almost obsessive oversight of John's expenses in medical supplies, as if balancing the books for his care could somehow compensate for the absence of her presence. The long-term consequences of this emotional outsourcing were profound. It reinforced a dangerous family precedent that personal tragedy was something to be delegated to staff, a trait we see echoed in the modern era whenever certain royals expect their aides to handle the emotional labor they are too entitled to perform themselves. The surrounding atmosphere of Sandringham changed whenever the Main family arrived for their annual winter stays. While the big house was filled with the scents of expensive cigars, wood smoke, and the frantic energy of shooting parties, Wood Farm remained a silent shadow kingdom on the periphery. The prince was forbidden from joining the family for any public-facing events, and even his walks on the estate were carefully timed to ensure he wouldn't stumble across a guest or a member of the local gentry. A longtime family acquaintance remarked on the chilling efficiency with which the prince was disappeared during these periods. He was a royal highness in name, but in practice he was less visible than the king's prize gun dogs. This forced invisibility had a warping effect on John's sense of self. He lived in a world where he was simultaneously a prince of the realm and a shameful secret, a duality that would have broken a more self-aware child, but which John, in his innocent detachment, seemed to accept with a heartbreaking, quiet grace. The inner life of Prince John at Wood Farm was, by all accounts, surprisingly contented, precisely because he was finally free from the crushing weight of royal expectation. Away from the critical eyes of his father, he could indulge in his love for gardening, spending hours tending to a small patch of earth that Lala Bill helped him cultivate. A source within the inner circle noted that in this isolated environment, John's personality actually began to bloom in ways it never could have at court. He was known for his funny sayings and a sweet, simple directness that charmed the local estate workers. Yet, this small-scale happiness only serves to highlight the cruelty of his situation. He was a boy who thrived on simple human connection, yet he was born into a family that viewed such simplicity as a weakness. The long-term consequence of his banishment was that the British public was deprived of seeing a more human, vulnerable side of the monarchy, a side that might have fostered genuine empathy rather than the distant, awestruck deference the king demanded. As the First World War raged on the continent, the isolation of Wood Farm became even more pronounced. The king and queen were understandably consumed by the existential threat to the empire, and the lost prince slipped even further down their list of priorities. The farmhouse became a stagnant pond, while the rest of the world was a raging ocean. For John, the war was merely a distant rumble, heard in the anxious voices of the staff or seen in the dwindling supplies delivered to the farm. But the institutional pressure never wavered. Even in the midst of a global catastrophe, the palace remained vigilant about the secret. John was the one sacrifice they had already made to ensure the dynasty looked strong enough to survive the storm. He was the ghost in the machine, a living reminder that for the Windsors, survival always comes at the cost of the heart. Life at Wood Farm for the teenage Prince John was a strange twilight existence, a sort of gilded purgatory where the boundaries between royal dignity and rural simplicity were perpetually blurred. Because he had been so thoroughly excised from the social calendar of the inner circle, his daily reality was populated not by dukes or foreign dignitaries, but by the salt-of-the-earth staff of the Sandringham estate. A source within the inner circle recalled that this was perhaps the only period in the history of the House of Windsor where a prince of the blood lived with the easy, unpretentious familiarity of a commoner. He was often seen out in the fields, his seizures permitting, chatting with the gardeners or watching the blacksmith at work with a wide-eyed, innocent fascination. This surrounding atmosphere of rural quietude was a profound mercy for the boy, yet it stood as a silent, damning indictment of his parents' refusal to integrate him into their own lives. While his brothers were being polished for their roles as the future leaders of a global empire, John was finding his greatest joy in the simple act of digging in the dirt, entirely oblivious to the fact that his very existence was considered a threat to the dignity of the throne he was born to stand beside. The pressure to keep the boy sequestered remained absolute, but it was his grandmother, the indomitable Queen Alexandra, who provided the only significant crack in the palace's wall of silence. Alexandra, the Dowager Queen, lived at Sandringham House and possessed a rebellious, empathetic streak that her son, King George V, conspicuously lacked. She was profoundly deaf and had suffered her own share of royal tragedies, which perhaps gave her a unique window into John's isolated soul. A longtime family acquaintance noted that it was Alexandra who insisted that the boy should not be entirely starved of companionship. Against the unspoken wishes of the king's office, she arranged for local estate children, the sons and daughters of laborers and grooms, to be brought to Wood Farm to play with the hidden prince. This created a surreal, heartbreaking tableau, a royal highness playing tag and hide-and-seek with children who would normally never be allowed to breathe the same air, all within the confines of a specially walled-off garden that served as both a playground and a cage. The inner monologue of these commoner children must have been one of confused awe, as they were coached by their parents never to mention their special friend outside the estate gates. For John, however, these interactions were his only lifeline to a world that didn't treat him like a medical specimen or a political liability. He was known to be a generous and sweet-tempered playmate, though his peculiarities, likely the manifestations of his autism, meant he lived in a world of literal truths and repetitive comforts. A well-meaning staff member recalled that John had a magic garden where he would arrange stones and plants in precise, obsessive patterns, finding a sense of order in a life that his own family had rendered chaotic and uncertain. The long-term consequences of this arrangement were bitter. While it gave John a fleeting sense of normalcy, it further alienated him from his own siblings. His brothers, particularly the future Edward VIII, viewed these forays into common company with a mixture of pity and a growing dark disdain, reinforcing the idea that John was no longer one of them. The atmosphere at Wood Farm was further complicated by the arrival of the Great War's aftermath. As the world outside began to grapple with the seismic shifts of the post-war era, John remained frozen in a perpetual innocent childhood. The psychological pressure on Lala Bill, his nanny, intensified during these years as she became the sole witness to the prince's slow physical decline. The seizures were becoming more exhausting, leaving the teenage John increasingly frail and prone to bouts of deep, confused lethargy. A source behind closed doors whispered that during her rare visits, Queen Mary would stand at a distance, her gloved hands tightly clasped, unable to bridge the emotional chasm that years of institutional coldness had created. She looked at her son and saw only the tragedy of what he wasn't, rather than the reality of who he was. This lack of physical affection from his mother was perhaps the most profound cruelty of all. In the rigid Windsor universe, a hug was a breach of protocol, and for a boy like John, who craved sensory connection, the vacuum was devastating. The long-term consequences of this isolation were beginning to manifest in a strange psychological drifting. John began to refer to himself in the third person, as if he too were becoming an observer of his own disappearing life. He would often ask Lala Bill when the prince was going to be allowed to go home, seemingly forgetting that he was already on his family's land. This disconnection from his own identity was the direct result of a family that had spent a decade treating him as a ghost. It is a chilling parallel to the modern day, where we see certain royals obsessed with identity and finding their voice through tell-all books and Netflix specials, seemingly unaware that the institution they criticize once had the power to literally erase a person's identity from the face of the earth. John didn't have a voice. He had a walled garden and a nanny who loved him when no one else would. As John approached his 13th birthday, the surrounding pressure of The Secret had reached its peak. The palace was preparing for the grand victory celebrations of 1919, a moment intended to solidify the monarchy's place at the heart of the nation. In this grand plan for a new, triumphant era, there was no room for a sickly, epileptic teenager who reminded the king of the frailty of his own bloodline. The decision was effectively made to keep the status quo of Wood Farm indefinitely. John was to be the permanent resident of the Norfolk Shadows. But fate, it seems, had a different, more merciful plan for the lost prince, one that would finally release him from the crushing weight of being a royal embarrassment. The atmosphere in the early days of 1919 was heavy with a sense of impending finality, as if the very air at Wood Farm knew that the boy's long, lonely vigil was coming to an end. The atmosphere surrounding the Christmas of 1918 at Sandringham was one of a fragile, forced gaiety, a desperate attempt by the House of Windsor to reclaim a sense of Victorian normalcy after the harrowing slaughter of the Great War. While the main house was ablaze with festive lights and the heavy scent of pine, Wood Farm remained a silent shadow kingdom where the 13-year-old Prince John lived out his final holiday season. In a rare, perhaps guilt-driven concession, the king and queen allowed John to be brought to the big house for a brief period to see the decorations, but the rules were as rigid as ever. He was to be seen by no one of consequence and whisked back to his isolation before the evening's formal festivities began. A source within the inner circle recalled the haunting sight of the boy being led through the back corridors like a ghost, haunting his own family's feast, a prince of the blood who was treated with less ceremony than the seasonal help. The inner monologue of his eldest brother, the future King Edward VIII, during this time provides a chilling window into the toxic narcissism that would eventually lead to the 1936 abdication. To Edward, David as he was known, John was not a brother to be pitied or a child to be protected. He was an animal, a biological glitch that offended his sense of aesthetic and social perfection. In his private correspondence to his mistress, Frida Dudley Ward, Edward's language was shockingly clinical and devoid of a single shred of fraternal warmth. He described John's presence as a regrettable nuisance and expressed a cold, sneering resentment that the family had to acknowledge the boy's existence at all. This is the same man, of course, who would later style himself as a victim of the cruel royal establishment, much like the current residents of Montecito. It seems that a certain brand of Windsor self-absorption, a belief that one's own desires outweigh the basic duties of human decency, is a trait that skips generations only to reappear with renewed vigor. The surrounding pressure of that final Christmas was palpable for the staff at Wood Farm, particularly for Lala Bill, who watched as John's health began a final steep decline. The seizures were no longer occasional disruptions. They were becoming a relentless tide that left the boy physically shattered and mentally adrift. A well-meaning staff member recalled that John seemed to sense his time was thinning, becoming even more attached to his magic garden and his simple routines as the world outside moved toward a triumphant post-war future. While the king and queen celebrated the survival of their throne, the boy who represented the vulnerability of their lineage was fading into the gray Norfolk mist. The long-term consequence of this callousness was the cementing of a family culture where empathy was viewed as a strategic weakness, a philosophy that would go on to haunt the monarchy for the next century. The pressure on Queen Mary during this final winter was immense, though she channeled it into her customary mask of impassive, bejeweled duty. She visited Wood Farm for tea, a ritual that someone close to palace circles described as an exercise in agonizing social distance. She would sit in the modest parlor, the Queen Empress of half the world, and watch her son, a boy she barely knew, struggling to maintain focus between the neurological storms in his brain. Her monologue was one of stiff upper lip survival. She'd convinced herself that John's isolation was a mercy, but the hollow look in her eyes suggested a woman who had buried her maternal instincts under several layers of state-mandated granite. This emotional detachment was not merely a personal choice, it was an institutional requirement. To feel for John was to admit that the crown had been cruel, and that was an admission the firm simply could not afford. As January 1919 dawned, the atmosphere at Wood Farm became increasingly heavy with a sense of impending finality. The winter was particularly harsh, the cold seeping through the flint walls of the farmhouse and mirroring the emotional chill emanating from the main estate. John's seizures had reached a level of frequency that the doctors could no longer ignore, yet the treatment remained one of quiet containment. There was no rush to bring in world-class specialists or to move the boy to a modern medical facility where he might have received better care. Such a move would have risked the very exposure the palace had spent a decade preventing. The long-term consequence of this medical neglect was the absolute assurance that John would never reach adulthood. He was being allowed to slip away, not out of malice perhaps, but out of a profound institutional relief that the problem was nearing its natural conclusion. The final days were marked by a tragic, quiet dignity within the walls of Wood Farm. Lala Bill remained his constant, unwavering anchor, her devotion the only thing standing between the prince and a total lonely void. A source behind closed doors whispered that even in his most dazed moments, John would reach for Lala's hand, finding in a nursery maid the sanctuary his mother could not provide. It is a damning reflection on the monarchy that the only true love this prince ever knew came from the help. As we prepare to discuss the final phone call that would change everything, we must reflect on the sheer, staggering weight of the secret John carried for his family. He was the lamb sacrificed at the altar of the Windsor image, and as the clock ticked toward 5:30 a.m. on that fateful January morning, the palace was already preparing to close the book on a life they had spent 13 years trying to erase. The silence of the early morning hours on the 18th of January, 1919, was shattered not by a royal fanfare, but by the frantic, desperate ringing of a telephone in the staff quarters of Buckingham Palace. At Wood Farm, the inevitable had finally occurred. At just 13 years old, Prince John had succumbed to a massive final seizure in his sleep. The atmosphere at the farmhouse was one of pure, unadulterated grief, a stark contrast to the clinical efficiency that was about to unfold at the higher levels of the state. A well-meaning staff member recalled that Lala Bill was found cradling the boy's cooling body, her world having collapsed in an instant, while the local doctor was summoned merely to sign the death certificate of a boy the world had already forgotten. The pressure now shifted entirely to the palace machine. They had to manage the death of a prince whose life they had spent a decade concealing, a delicate operation of acknowledging a tragedy without inviting the scrutiny they so deeply feared. The inner monologue of Queen Mary upon receiving the news is perhaps the most revealing and chilling aspect of this entire saga. In her private diary, a document usually reserved for the dry recording of weather and official luncheons, she wrote with a pragmatic detachment that is truly breathtaking. She described the news of her youngest son's death as a great shock, yet in the very next breath, she noted that for a child with his unfortunate condition, death was in fact a great relief. It is the word relief that echoes through history like a cold wind. To Mary, the tragedy was not the loss of her child's potential or the ending of a young life. The relief was for the institution. The blemish was gone. The secret could now be permanently interred. A source close to palace circles remarked that the Queen's immediate concern was not the mourning process, but the logistics of a funeral that needed to be significant enough to respect protocol, yet private enough to prevent a public autopsy of the boy's life. King George V's reaction was similarly filtered through the lens of his rigid naval stoicism. While he undoubtedly felt a flicker of paternal loss, it was inextricably tied to a sense of closure on a chapter of his reign that had brought him nothing but embarrassment and frustration. A source within the inner circle noted that the king's primary objective was to ensure the funeral was a strictly local affair at Sandringham, away from the prying eyes of the London press. This surrounding pressure to maintain the Windsor brand, even in death, was absolute. There would be no lying in state, no grand procession through the streets of the capital, and no national day of mourning. The boy who had been hidden in life was to be hidden in death, buried in a quiet corner of the St. Mary Magdalene churchyard, far from the magnificent royal vaults of Windsor Castle, where his ancestors, and eventually his parents, would rest. The long-term consequences of this clinical reaction were devastating for the remaining royal children. They watched as their mother and father essentially switched off the memory of their brother with a frightening speed. For the future King George VI, who possessed a far more sensitive nature, the coldness of John's passing must have reinforced his own fears of falling short of the crown's impossible standards. Meanwhile, a source behind closed doors remarked on the shocking contrast between this genuine royal tragedy and the performative, self-indulgent grief we see today. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle have built an entire brand out of their supposed suffering within the royal system, yet here was a boy who was literally erased from his family tree for the crime of being ill. John didn't get an interview with Oprah or a multi-million-dollar book deal to tell his truth. He got a quiet burial in the Norfolk soil and a mother who described his passing as a logistical convenience. The atmosphere during the days following the death was one of hushed, almost guilty activity. The palace issued a brief, carefully worded statement that alluded to the prince's long-term ill health, but provided no specifics that might satisfy the curiosity of the few who still remembered his birth. The pressure on the press to respect the family's privacy was immense, a polite but firm instruction from the king's office that was largely obeyed. Inside Wood Farm, Lala Bill was left to pack away the simple toys and the gardening tools of a boy who had been her entire life. A well-placed source noted that while the Queen sent Lala a sympathetic note, there was no invitation to remain within the royal household in a position of significance. Lala had been the guardian of the secret, and now that the secret was dead, her presence was an uncomfortable reminder that the palace preferred to forget. As the funeral preparations were finalized, the clinical erasure of Prince John reached its zenith. His name was omitted from the next edition of the official history of the royal family, and photos of him were quietly moved to the back of the royal archives. The machinery of the crown was performing its final, most impressive trick, making a prince disappear into the mist of history. This was the ultimate price of the Windsor dynasty's survival, a cold, calculated trade of human empathy for institutional longevity. The boy was gone. The relief was palpable, and the king could now turn his full attention to the grand, glittering future of a post-war empire, untethered from the inconvenient reminder of his own family's fragility. The final act was about to begin, not with a bang, but with a silent, heavy church door closing on the memory of the lost prince. The funeral of Prince John, held on a biting, overcast afternoon in January 1919, was the final somber act in a drama of systematic concealment. There were no flags at half-mast in the capital, no muffled drums, and certainly no outpouring of national grief. Instead, the boy was laid to rest in the small parochial churchyard of St. Mary Magdalene at Sandringham, attended mostly by the local estate workers who had actually known him. The atmosphere was one of profound, heavy silence, a silence that seemed to be enforced by the very presence of the king and queen, who stood like statues of granite against the Norfolk wind. A source within the inner circle remarked that even at the graveside, the emotional distance was staggering. Queen Mary remained perfectly composed, her mourning veil a shield against any flicker of maternal agony that might have threatened her poise. For the king, the ceremony was a duty to be dispatched with naval efficiency, a final clearing of the decks, so the monarchy could sail into the post-war era without the drag of a damaged reputation. The surrounding pressure to move on was so immense that the erasure of Prince John began almost before the soil had settled on his coffin. Within weeks, the machinery of the palace was working at a fever pitch to ensure that John's 13 years of life left as little trace as possible on the official record. A well-placed source noted that in the subsequent Diamond Jubilee programs and family genealogies, John's name was frequently omitted, or his birth mentioned only in the briefest, most clinical footnotes. It was as if the House of Windsor had collectively decided to treat his existence as a fever dream that had finally broken. This wasn't merely a private family choice. It was an institutional mandate to preserve the myth of the perfect family. When one contrasts this with the modern spectacle of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, who seem to believe that every perceived slight and internal quarrel is a matter of global importance, the cold, quiet efficiency with which the early Windsors deleted a human being is nothing short of chilling. John did not have a platform to complain about his lack of voice, because his family had essentially taken his identity to the grave with him. The inner monologue of the surviving siblings during this period was one of forced, almost pathological forgetting. They were taught that to mourn John too publicly or too long was a form of disloyalty to the crown's required strength. A source behind closed doors remarked that his brother David, the future Edward VIII, felt a palpable sense of triumph that the regrettable nuisance was finally gone, viewing the death as a successful pruning of the family tree. The long-term consequences of this lack of empathy were catastrophic, fostering a culture of emotional illiteracy that would eventually lead to the monarchy's disastrous inability to handle the arrival of more sensitive, expressive figures like Princess Diana decades later. By learning to bury John so effectively, the Windsors learned how to bury their own humanity, a trade-off that secured the throne but hollowed out the heart of the family. Yet, despite the palace's best efforts to scrub the record clean, the memory of the lost prince survived in the most humble of places. Lala Bill, the nanny who had been his only true sanctuary, kept a framed photograph of her Johnny on her mantelpiece until her dying day, a silent act of rebellion against the family she served. A long-time family acquaintance recalled that the estate workers at Sandringham continued to speak of the boy with a hushed, protective affection, keeping his story alive in the local oral history even as London ignored him. The atmosphere of Wood Farm remained haunted by his absence for years, a physical reminder of the boy who had been loved by the servants but discarded by the sovereigns. It is a powerful summary of the gravity of the situation, that the truest loyalty and deepest grief for a prince of the realm came not from his royal parents, but from the commoners who saw the boy behind the title. As we reflect on this tragic chapter, we are forced to confront the unvarnished truth about the British monarchy, an institution that thrives on a peculiar, necessary kind of ruthlessness. The story of Prince John is a testament to a time when the firm was more than just a nickname. It was a cold, calculating reality where individuals were merely pawns in a much larger, more important game of survival. We live in an age where the modern royals are obsessed with their truth and their narratives, yet they would do well to remember the boy who lived in the shadows of Wood Farm. He was the one who truly paid the price for their privilege, the one who was sacrificed so the crown could remain polished and perfect in the eyes of the world. His life was a tragedy of erasure, but his memory serves as a vital reminder of the human cost of wearing that heavy, golden burden. The lost prince may have been hidden for 13 years and erased for 80 more, but the truth has a persistent way of rising through the cracks of even the most gilded pavement. It is a story of intrigue, of a mother's cold duty, a father's ashamed silence, and a dynasty's relentless pursuit of perfection at any cost. Leave your thoughts below. I read every word you write, and I am curious to know if you believe the monarchy has truly changed, or if the Wood Farm solution still exists in some more modern, sophisticated form. And if you value this unvarnished look at the monarchy, do ensure you are subscribed and share this with those who appreciate the truth.